Hey, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of sitting down with none other than Jeff Alberts. Jeff, how you doing today?
I'm hanging. How you doing?
I'm doing well. I realize that this episode, some may call us the bookends of 3DMJ because you are technically the first member and I'm technically the last member. So we kind of have the full spectrum here of the team.
So what you're saying is I'm the old guy and you're the young guy. I see how that works.
It could be interpreted like that, but I think that's a great segue into our conversation today about exercises.
But are you the youngest of the group? Are you? Or is
I'm not the youngest.
Or is it Steve?
I think Steve is younger.
Okay. All right. Close enough though.
I am
But
getting
we're both
more,
Italian. So here we go.
right.
East Coast, West Coast too, so that's cool.
Perfect. So what are we talking about today? Today we're talking about exercise selection. We're talking about the exercises that you may have forgotten about. And this conversation is going to talk about the importance of not being locked into, say, the big three or the classic bodybuilding exercises, and to have some freedom to try some other movement patterns. And we're going to kind of get into a lot of the reasons why that may be something worth looking into. So, Jeff, before we jumped on the call, we were talking a little bit about some of your posts with different exercises that you choose to do and why you choose to do them. You have some more followers than I have. My mom follows me. My brother follows me. My wife does not follow me, so that I don't know what that's about. But you have a much bigger following than me. So just kind of walk us through how things may be misinterpreted or how there's more nuance behind some of the exercises that you have come to choose today in your current training.
Sure. You know, my wife doesn't really follow me either on Instagram. She's like, why am I going to follow you when we live together and I see you every day? So I don't need to go in there and like your posts and all that. So, but anyways, yeah, I think the one exercise that, we were talking about before we got on that I think is definitely worth discussing is, for years I was doing behind the neck press with a barbell, and the last few months I kind of incorporated the movement again, but this time on a Smith machine. And that's raising a lot of eyebrows. Like every time I post it up, like I usually get at least one or two people like, why are you doing that? They say it's bad for your shoulders, et cetera, et cetera. And when I go back to my history, which is now running close to 35 years, like the first 20 years or so, I was doing behind the neck presses with no issues whatsoever, like no pain, no shoulder issues. And I progressed really well on it. And the reason I was doing it was just because I was introduced to it by one of the guys that showed me how to do Mike Mintzer's high intensity training. So he did it, and I was like, okay, he's doing it. He's telling me to do it. So I just started doing it. And I just adapted it, to my training over the years and never had no issues. And then probably in 2010, 2009, somewhere in there, that's when I met up with, the rest of the guys here at 3D Muscle Journey. So I started to get more involved into the evidence-based community, because up until that point, I didn't even know what evidence-based community was. I didn't follow research or any of that stuff. You could call me, I was a straight up bro. So, they, in a sense, were like, hey, that exercise probably not the most ideal for your shoulders. So maybe we do, regular, military press or overhead press, to the front. So that's what I did. I transitioned to that, and I had some success with it early on, no issues. And then I started to get really good with overhead pressing as far as being able to increase the loads. And I remember I was actually running 531 with it, and I hit a 225-pound overhead press. And this was in 2011. So, maybe a year or 2 years after going to the, doing military presses to the front. So my strength shot up, had no issues. And it wasn't maybe, I want to say 2012, I think it was, or early 2013. I was doing overhead press, and then my right shoulder, I felt a sharp pain. And you can kind of say that's where everything kind of unraveled with that specific exercise. And then from that period, I started to dabble with other movements, like the single arm overhead dumbbell press. I rolled with that. Kind of went back and forth between that and overhead pressing. Much lighter weight though. Once I injured, I didn't want to go heavy again. And then I started doing just regular standard dumbbell overhead pressing, bilateral. And then recently, so fast forward to where we're at now, a lot of that single arm overhead pressing started to bug my right shoulder. And then I had a left elbow issue I was also dealing with. So, trying to do like bilateral movements with dumbbells was kind of bothering me as well. So after doing some experimentation, I got myself back on the Smith machine. And I was like, let me try this. And you can say over the last 4 or 5 months, I've kind of slowly but surely kind of perfected it to where I can do it without any issues. So it's interesting for me that going through all that history, I was swayed by the external sources to switch something that was working. Like, the old saying, don't fix what isn't broke. Well, that's basically what ended up happening. And I mean, I don't regret going through it because obviously I have a story to tell now, and hopefully people could kind of, take it and maybe learn from it and maybe prevent some of the things that I went through. But that's kind of, a little bit of the history there. But there's a lot of nuances that I'm doing with that behind the neck press with the Smith machine that we can probably dabble with and talk about as well. But that's kind of the backstory behind that one.
Yeah, I think that's a great story because it just goes to show, and this is something that in my world as a physical therapist, I find myself preaching a lot, is that there really aren't bad exercises, and it kind of also feeds into exercise technique as well.
Mm-hmm.
We have a way of adapting over time to different movement patterns. So an example I like to use a lot is someone squatting or deadlifting with a bit of a rounded back. If that person has done that for an entire lifting career, their body has built up resiliency toward that. They've adapted to that type of movement pattern. And then if we could snap our fingers and put them in a quote unquote neutral spine, I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't feel comfortable or if they felt some pain or some soreness afterwards. And so it's important to remember that we do adapt to different movement patterns. And I've heard the same things about exercises like the behind the neck press, upright rows, right? I mean, you name it, we could go all day. Sissy squats, right? All these different exercises. And I think sometimes anatomically they may appear like they're causing a lot of stress to a certain joint. But we're not machines. We're not robots. We're a moving, adapting system of muscles and joints and bones. And so I think sometimes exercises get a bad rap unnecessarily. An example would be if we look at studies that show the forces that go into the kneecap with something like a squat where the knees drift over the toes. The forces are astronomical. It's very high. But if we also look at the forces through our kneecap just descending stairs, it's also very high. So sometimes these exercises in the setting of a gym seem very scary, but then if we look into our daily lives, we can adapt to these things and our bodies can handle it. So I think that was a great way to start kind of your journey. And you used to behind the neck press perfectly fine, and then you switched it up. And it's not a bad thing to switch up an exercise. Like you experienced also, you changed it up to a military press. You were rolling with that. That felt good for a little while, and then it didn't. And then you went to the single arm press and you were rolling with that. That felt good, and then it did it, and then you adjusted. So there is benefit to perhaps just cycling in different movement patterns rather than just grinding the same ones over and over and over again to kind of prevent some of these like overuse type things. And anyone who listens to this or has heard me talk, this is understanding that pain is complex and usually isn't just from an exercise, a single exercise that we're doing. But for this conversation, there's that balance between, yes, we want to adapt to a movement, but we also don't want to just keep grinding the same trench over and over and over again without giving our our joints and soft tissues a break from that movement pattern.
Yeah, I think for me, like the goal is always to try to improve performance, right? You want to try to progress on these lifts, and I would say a good 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, I was like a little bit more of a proponent of like, hey, let's keep these movements in a little while longer to master technique, to improve performance. But now looking in hindsight, I can kind of see that probably left things in a little too long because, anytime I've really kind of developed, and this is for me personally, like anytime I develop aches and pains, it's usually when I'm under the most demand, meaning the load has gotten, pretty darn high, like the 225-pound overhead presses. And this is not like using leg drive or anything. This is like clean form. So my shoulders and triceps are doing all the work. So I'm thinking about it, now when I program people, I'm like, here's this anterior delt, medial delt. It's not the biggest musculature in the world, but yet here we are trying to do a single. Like to me, it kind of just makes no sense anymore. So I rarely program that specific lift under 8 reps. Like it's usually 8 plus. And what I found with like the Smith machine behind the neck press, like for me, anywhere between 10 to 20 is kind of like a nice sweet spot. And more times than not, it's more like even 15 to 20s feel really good. Like if you think about a lateral, we're like doing 12 to 20 reps, most people, right? So do we really need to go super, super heavy, something over our head, especially if we're not using leg drive or anything? And then thinking about like how your lower back and all that has to support your torso and all that as well. So there's a lot of musculature that's also has to support that lift from that capacity. So for me, it's always been anytime I've kept the exercise in for a long period of time and got really good at it, that's where I start to run into a little hot water. So now I'm a little bit more accepting of like rotating exercises a little more frequently. You need to have them in there long enough to make sure you're mastering technique, because that can be an issue, obviously, if you're not performing the exercise correctly. But I think, rotating them out, whether it's once a month or twice a month, once every 2 months or something like that. I mean, that is definitely super beneficial.
Yeah, I think that's a good point with focusing on how, military press isn't just a shoulder and tricep movement. You're using other muscles in that movement, just like every other exercise. So sometimes, maybe your back hurts for some reason and you can't military press. Well, a landmine press could be a great option because it's less direct force onto your spine. You're still getting a good training effect on your shoulders. So yeah, I think that's also a great point, just to consider these movements that maybe you feel married to or afraid to deviate from. Just consider the volume of other muscles that are getting hit with these movements. And then also the rep ranges that you talked about. I think that's a great point. Some movements just feel better in different rep ranges. And it also depends on the goal too. So if your goal is hypertrophy, you and I kind of share that same goal, I'd have no problem hitting the same, rep scheme with different movements just because it feels better. I just feel more connection. I feel a better pump. Just feels better overall. It doesn't feel achy, doesn't get, it just, so yeah, I think it's important I think one of the themes that we're going to keep coming back to with this conversation is find what works for you. Experiment with some different movements, experiment with some different loads, some different rep ranges, and just see what feels best for you, and know that you and your training partner, or you and someone you follow on Instagram are different. Your structures are different. Your bodies are different. So things may feel better for you that don't feel so good for someone else. So just keep that in mind, that this is very individual, and just, kind of find your own groove.
I think the hard part though is for people who aren't as experienced. Like that's the hard part, because they're looking externally like, okay, this guy on YouTube says, hey, these exercises are considered the best or the most optimal or the most safe. So how do you know when to like venture away from, what the external sources are saying, and then now starting to, dabble with your own experimentation and taking your own notes and all that and trying to figure out what does actually work and feel best for you. Because it's again, it comes back to, again, when I post up, like, for example, I do Smith machine hack squats, and people, when they see that at first, like, oh my God, what's this guy doing? He's on his midfoot. He's not even on his heels. There's no hip hinge at all. And he's using a Smith machine. Like, what's this guy doing? But without kind of knowing my individual context, it's not necessarily I'm doing something wrong, because this is something that I've learned over time, is that for me, in order to, like, if I want to get more direct quad work and I'm limited on equipment because I train at home, well, I have a Smith machine, so I can mimic a hack squat on there by keeping my torso upright, by stepping out in front instead of keeping my feet under me like a traditional squat. I can step forward, and if I were to drive through my heels, because that's one of the questions I get, why are you in midfoot, not why aren't you on the heels? Because that's what they teach you when you back squat, is to go through your heels. Well, if I do that, then I'm going to put a tremendous amount of burden on my lower back. Like, it feels like all that force just goes straight to my lower back, and you can kiss my lower back goodbye. So I have to stay on the midfoot. And yeah, I do feel more pressure in the knees, but again, if you think about the layers of context, like, instead of going super heavy, okay, I'm going to keep my reps, let's say 6 to 10, but I'm going to leave a good 3 or 4 reps in reserve. So the overall intensity isn't overwhelming. It's not putting too much of pressure on my knees. And another thing I could even do if I want to add another layer is to, like, pre-fatigue my quads. Like, maybe I do some leg extensions ahead of time. So that way I don't have to utilize as much load on that Smith machine hack squat. So it takes some of that pressure off the connective tissue. But I could go on, but yeah, there's so much layers and layers of context that, of course, when you're new, it's like, how do you even know any of that? It's so like foreign in a sense. And again, you're kind of relying on the guy on YouTube who's saying some generalities. Like, how do I kind of discern what to do?
Yeah. I think we all probably started there in muscle magazines, or I guess, I don't know, are muscle magazines around anymore? Am I dating myself?
I haven't bought one in years.
Man.
I used to have stacks of Flex magazine, and I remember, I'm going to save these. I wish I would have saved them, but I ended up throwing them out.
I have a bin of my muscle and fitness magazines. I just can't get rid of them. They're just so sentimental. I just remember myself reading them cover to cover over and over again. But I vividly remember articles that say, the 4 best exercises for your shoulders, and behind the neck press works your middle deltoid, and reverse fly works the back of your deltoid, and this muscle work. So I have to do all these different exercises because these are the best exercises for my shoulder because this guy said so in this magazine. I think that's the culture now as well with social media. It's just we get bombarded with these messages. And I think you had a great point with the hack squat and focusing, making it more of a quad / knee focused movement. You're going to feel more in your knees, but that's probably the goal of the exercise. The goal is to work and train knee flexion and extension under load, which is what you want with that exercise. One of the things in my world as a physical therapist that we see a lot is, so say, for example, if someone is recovering from an ACL reconstruction, they're a couple months out from surgery, and for recovery from an ACL or any kind of knee tendonitis or anything like that, I guess we could lump in here too. We want to strengthen the quads. We want to train the painful movement. We want to train knee flexion under load. A lot of times we can squat heavy and perfectly fine without flexing our knees much. So we can make that squat a very hip dominant squat. If I were to just let a post-operative patient ask them just to go squat and hold this weight and squat, that feels great. Nice deep squat, standing back up, feels great. Okay, let's just keep loading that. They're doing a great heavy squat. I discharge them to go back on the soccer field, and bang, the second they have to use their quad, they re-tear that ACL because we weren't training that quad, because we were just having them do that squatting pattern, but we weren't actually training that quad because their body was so great at compensating for that and avoiding that. So coming back to, in a bodybuilder sense, if the goal is to train your quads and you're just squatting and doing the back squat over and over and over again, that's probably not the best way to train your quads. You may want to add in a heel lift, or you may want to add in some knee extensions or a sissy squat. This way we know that we're hitting those quads how we want to, and we're not just relying on the king of leg exercises, the squat.
I was just going to say, yeah. So I have a good story for that, but yeah, I'll let you finish.
No, yeah, I mean, I'm pretty much done, but yeah, just the idea that, squats are great, but we have to remember the goal of why we're squatting. So for the most part, unless we're competing in a powerlifting meet and we're training our competition squat, for the most part, the goal isn't to squat. The goal is to train a specific muscle or to grow a specific muscle. And we want to make sure that we're hitting that, and we're not just kind of getting global fatigue and getting a little bit of quad, a little bit of glute, a little bit here and there, and we're actually focusing on the muscles that we want to focus on.
Yeah. It kind of goes back, like you said, the king of exercise. So that's kind of what a lot of people, when they're first starting out, they hear the squat, king of lower body exercises, the deadlift or the bench press, right? Pull-ups is another one that I'm like, we can probably do something that'll hit your lats probably a little bit more efficiently because you have better control. We can touch on that too, I guess. But getting back to the squat, so kind of the same thing back in the 2010, 2011 era where the power building started to really catch fire. So everybody and their mother was doing the big three, including bodybuilders. So of course I'm like, okay, let me do what the young kids are doing. Let me keep up. So I got my squat. I was like, okay, I start, because before that I didn't squat. When my bro days, I did hack squats, I did RDL, and I did leg curl, and I did calf raises. That was it for my legs. And I had pretty good legs up until that point. So I'm like, oh, okay, let me do this squat thing. So I got my squat built up to 460 for a single. I was regularly hitting low fours for reps. And in 2013, we had a bet with Alberto and Eric. First one to 500 is going to win this bet. I was winning that too. I knew I was going to win. But what ended up happening is I tore my calf, and that's another podcast. But I had so much success doing squats and deadlifts, because I didn't deadlift either up until that point, that in 2014, I had my best season as a professional. Won a pro show, took fourth at Worlds. I was like, okay, man, this is it. I know what I'm doing now. I got this on lock. Well, fast forward a couple years later, my body was like, okay, we're not doing this no more. And I had a lower back strain squatting. Good form, good technique. I just think, again, running the same things over and over again and building the loads up so much. It's just week in and week out, you're just pounding away. Body just said, okay, you're done. Had a lower back strain. And of course I was like, okay, it happens. I'm just going to, rehab it, come back. And I did. And then it happened again. And my stubborn ass was like, I have to squat and deadlift, because if I don't do these, then I'm not going to have the same success I had before that. So stubborn, did it again, third time. And finally I was like, okay, this is dumb. Why am I doing this? So that's when I went away from squats. And now I was like, okay, I purchased the leg press, relied on leg extensions, the Smith machine hack squat. So I started to find other ways to train my legs outside of the quote unquote king of exercises. And I seen, just as much success, in my 2019 season without doing, squatting and deadlifting regularly. Now, fast forward to now, I just started doing squats again. And the reason I started to do it again is that I have this itch in me to kind of overcome the fear and see if I can basically train that squat again without occurring another injury, but going at it based off of my past history. Okay, I kind of know now, looking in hindsight, why it was happening. My body was just tapped out. And at the time, if I recall, I was dieting quite a bit. So I think my body just wasn't very resilient anymore at that point. So with all that history, now I could kind of try to game plan that squat. But I think fear was kind of just holding me back from actually doing it again. So far so good. But yeah, I think I just wanted to kind of share that, because I think sometimes we just get caught up in specific exercises being quote unquote optimal, when there's really so many other different ways to get the job done.
Yeah, I'm glad you shared that, because that goes to show that we're not saying that you can't make progress with just the squat. But we're saying that there may be better ways to do it. And if you had to deviate from the squat, don't think, oh crap, there go my gains, because there are other ways to get the effect. There's other ways to get the effect. If the squat feels great for you and you enjoy doing it, do it. But just know that there are probably other ways to get a similar, if not better, effect. And that fear that you talk about, I feel like that's one of the hardest things to overcome, because you don't know. There's so many factors in a successful prep or competition season that you're afraid to stop doing one, or you're afraid to change something because you don't know if that was the thing that was helping. And I know I've experienced that myself. I mean, it's definitely helped to educate myself, like obviously discovering 3DMJ and the like. You start to realize, okay, that probably wasn't quite as important as I thought it was. So it's okay if I deviate a little bit here and swap this in for that. But in my own lifting career and as a physical therapist, that I have had similar exercises that I used to love and think that I had to do, and then they just didn't feel right for me. So I said, you know what, like, what am I doing? Let me just change it out and try something different. And I had great progress with them. And one of them is the deadlift. So I used to conventional deadlift. I used to sumo deadlift. And my back would just be screaming at me all the time. And I was hitting decent weight, but I didn't feel like I was hitting any muscle groups. Like I didn't feel like I was hitting any of the muscles that I wanted to. And then I switched it to an RDL. And my RDL now is my main hip hinge and deadlift movement. And it just connects with me so much more than any other deadlift I've ever done. So now an RDL is my main deadlift. And my goal, like we said, is hypertrophy. So I don't have to step on the platform and do a conventional or a sumo deadlift. So I feel great just doing my RDLs and progressing my RDLs and perfecting my technique with the RDL. And that's my little go-to. Same thing with the bench press. I used to think I had to bench press with a barbell because for some reason holding a metal bar that someone made at some point in history is the best way that your chest will grow and get stronger. I just didn't connect with it. I didn't feel it that well in my chest. And then I said, you know what? I always liked dumbbell presses better. So why not just use dumbbell press as my main pressing movement? And I made the switch. And it was hard in the beginning because I'm leaving the barbell bench press and how dare you? But I felt great with dumbbells. Fast forward to 2020, I don't have heavy enough dumbbells to do to make the dumbbell bench press my main pressing movement. So I'm back to the barbell bench press because I have a bar, I have Olympic weights, so that is the way that I could load my press. So now I'm back to my benching with the bar. But I think the theme is that it was okay to switch back and forth, and I just kind of followed what felt best for me. Another one example for me is the overhead press. I do not feel good pressing two dumbbells over my head at the same time. My left shoulder, for some reason, just gets a sharp pain at the top, no matter what. I've gone through the super biomechanical specific diagnosis coming right out of physical therapy school. I got to strengthen my lower trap. I have to get more thoracic mobility. I have to strengthen my rotator cuff. Oh my gosh, I think I have a tear. I'm impinging. Is my labrum torn? I think this, I think that. I read this, I read that. And how embarrassing. I'm a physical therapist and I have shoulder pain and I can't get myself better. So after going down that rabbit hole, I said, why don't I just try a different movement? And I started single arm dumbbell pressing, which felt a little better. And then I started doing lateral raises before overhead pressing. And I found that supersetting a lateral raise with a dumbbell overhead press felt perfectly fine. So something about pre-fatiguing my shoulders before doing the overhead press felt good.
Kind of loosened it up a little bit. Yeah.
Fast forward to 2020 in my basement gym. I don't have the dumbbells. I don't have the ability to do that. I'm landmine pressing for my overhead pressing movements, and it feels great. But my point again is that I haven't been. It's a paradigm shift. It's okay to leave a movement that just isn't agreeing with you, I think, is probably the main takeaway.
Really quick favor, guys. If you enjoy these shows and have been a listener for quite some time, we would really appreciate it if you could take the time to give us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever your preferred podcast app may be. Having lots of ratings and audience feedback makes our show become more visible across multiple platforms, and it supports our mission of helping as many people as we can to be the best athletes, coaches, and lifting enthusiasts that they could possibly be. So if you're not driving and wouldn't be dangerous, pause this thing right now and give us an honest review over on your podcast app, and we would love you even more than we already do. Thanks for taking the time, and we hope you enjoy the show.
I think the issue with a lot of people is they're trying to conform to the optimal, what people are saying, like this movement's more optimal. So like for me, just like a general rule of thumb for me, how I kind of think of my exercise selection is I think of, okay, what exercise can I get really good mind muscle connection with? Like where I can really connect, have good form, feel the intended musculature working well, where I can just fire it really well. And the second would be like comfort and safety. Like if I can do the lift with no pain, no discomfort, I can groove it really well, it's a keeper. And then the third one is, do I actually enjoy the movement I'm doing? So that's how I kind of like, I know it's not like so much science based, but I think for me, it's like I'm trying to blend and marry all these things to the movement. And I think in just my bodybuilding in general, I've learned to now like, okay, yes, I'm looking at research and I'm also, looking at practicality of things. Like sometimes, you can do something that's considered super optimal based on research, but it just doesn't jive well with life. And then again, the safety, the comfort, and the enjoyability factor. So I'm trying to marry all those things into Jeff's approach. And I think sometimes, when we're looking at other people, we have to like my advice to people who are trying to learn about bodybuilding, like a little more on a deeper level, not just looking at just the evidence-based stuff, but actually ask questions like, hey, why are you doing that behind the neck press? Why are you doing the upright row? What's the context behind it? Because if you can ask the question, if someone is kind enough to share the reasons why, well, that's how you're going to learn more. It might apply to your situation or it might not, but in the future, if maybe it does apply, then you're like, oh yeah, I remember when so-and-so was doing this because of X, Y, and Z. Maybe I can use that tool. So I think just, you have to be very open-minded. You have to be take initiative to ask questions and not just make assumptions. Like when you're following someone based off of some external source that says, hey, this is how you're supposed to do things.
So it's almost like what I'm hearing is we shouldn't judge people, and we should be open-minded and hear people out and listen to their side of the story and understand, and maybe we can improve ourselves. Even if we don't agree, maybe we can take something out of it. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, maybe I should run for president.
Yeah, I mean that you knocked it out of the park there. That's the key to everything, and I think that's one of the great things that we all love about bodybuilding is that there's things that we could carry into every aspect of our lives. I love the safety, comfort, and enjoyability kind of funnel that you run the exercises through, because say we have someone who maybe doesn't have too many injuries or maybe doesn't have too many constraints, that could be overwhelming. Like, where do I start? How do I know which exercise to do? Like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
I understand that I don't have to squat. I can leg press, or I could do this, or I could do that, but I can do any one. So which one do I do? And I think having that funnel of, well, let's try them out. Which one do you feel more of a connection with? Which one do you feel safest with? Which one do you feel, which one do you enjoy the most, right? Kind of like my RDL thing. I love RDLs, but I hate them at the same time, but I love them. So I enjoy doing them. And that's a huge factor. So I think even someone without any constraints, that can be overwhelming. So I think if we give that funnel of look, we can do all of these different pieces, but let's look at it through this funnel. And now we have maybe 3 options instead of 9 options.
But if you're fairly new or even intermediate or whatever, like if you master those basic exercises, like if you learn how to squat, if you learn how to do RDL, you learn how to do deadlift, you learn how to row, you learn how to overhead press. you master those, then it's a lot easier to take that technique and roll it into other exercises. And basically, like, our lifting library is kind of a great teacher for that. And it gives context around all that stuff, like how to interplay movements. Like, maybe, hey, this alternative might be better because of X, Y, and Z. But I think if you're just starting out, like, learning to actually move from point A to point B with those basic movements, yes, I guess we'd call them the king of exercise, just because when you learn that technique, like when you learn how to do a deadlift, then an RDL becomes a lot easier to learn and to master. Same thing, you go into like any of the hinging movements, right? Good mornings, hyperextensions, it's all kind of based off same principles. And the same thing with squats and all that. So everything kind of just transcends off of that. So I think that's a good start. And then obviously when you're going through learning those movements, you start to feel what actually feels good or not. Like, oh yeah, they tell me I should be driving through my heel on a squat, but I'm off balance when I do it. I feel like I'm going to fall backwards. So, hey, maybe I do need to push a little bit more from my midfoot in order to maintain balance. Maybe you're like, hey, I want to get a little more quad activation out of my squat. So, okay, let me see what happens when I go to my midfoot. Oh, actually feeling my quads a little bit more so. So there's just like, you start from a base, but then you start to learn, like, take notes on yourself, like what feels good, what doesn't feel good. Take notes, and then just slowly but surely start making these little changes, and you start learning these little nuances that you need to do to try to, again, get the best mind muscle connection. You're safe and comfortable, and you actually enjoy it, because no one wants to fall backwards on a squat. That's not very fun.
Yeah, I've been there.
You don't want to end up being one of those YouTube videos, right? Like, oh, damn, did you see that guy?
All I have to say is I'm glad that the internet wasn't as much of a thing when I was working out in high school in my parents' garage and listening to the Rocky soundtrack. And yeah, I've been
you and Brad, right?
Wait, so funny, real quick. In my garage, to this day, in my parents' backyard, if you look, if you look up at the ceiling, it says one more rep. It's written in pink sidewalk chalk, because that's what my brother and I had at the time. So that's where the bench was placed. So when you look up there, it said one more rep, and that has gotten me pinned under a bar and on a cold winter's night, a time or two. That's for sure.
That's pretty hardcore. Yeah.
And that's how I learned never to put clips on the end of a barbell when you're benching by yourself, because you need to do the old push to one side, push to the other side.
I'm gonna share a story that I've only shared. Oops, I almost knocked over my microphone. That I've only shared in our team meeting. So this is like, so in high school. Okay, so this is the ego thing, right? This is the typical ego, right? The guy's like, oh, I gotta lift the most weight, right? So I'm on the leg press, and mind you, I don't train legs in high school, so it's like this is like a new lift for me. I'm like, okay, so we load up this leg press. I don't remember how much weight was on there. Let's just say it was way more than needed to be. So I get in there, and of course, the whole gym is surrounding me. All the other kids were just surrounding me, watching me go to lift this. Because at the time, like, I was bench pressing like 330, like doubling my body weight. So I was the strong kid. Well, not on legs. So I go to do this weight. I lower the weight down, and as I go to try to push it up, I just ripped the biggest fart, like the biggest fart. And that weight just basically came down like super quick. They had to pull it off of me. And of course, all the dudes are just dying, laughing. Everybody's like, oh, that's sick, gross, right away. But that was probably the most embarrassing gym moment of my life. It was a valuable lesson, though. Like, okay, I need to probably lower the weight down on a leg press. Yeah.
I love it.
I don't know if that has anything to do with what we're talking about, but I needed to share that.
I love it. Yeah. That could be a podcast in and of itself. Cause I just thought of 5 other stories from college of, it was raining, and I went on the wooden platform to do, reverse lunges with a barbell on my back, training to failure, if not past failure.
Oh my gosh.
I just ended up crumbling under a folded leg. Not sure how it folded, but I just look back on some of the things that I did, and I'm thankful that I made it through. But to kind of circle back to one of the points you made, Jeff, how sometimes learning the deadlift makes Romanian deadlifting better, or makes good mornings better, or hyperextensions better. One of the studies that I've heard Eric talk about, he's covered it in mass, and I also cover it in the BFR course that should be out at this point. So be sure to check that out. But it's the idea of specificity, and the basic idea is that if you have something like a squat and a leg press, if you train the squat, well, let's start with if you train the leg press, you will get stronger at the leg press, but not much stronger at the squat. If you train the squat, you will get stronger at the squat as well as the leg press. And what the conclusion kind of was from that was that the complexity of the movement will have some carryover to less complex movements. So if you get those foundational movements down and you have the movement pattern of the squat and you're training the squat and you're progressing, you will likely have some carryover. It will be easier to make the transition from a squat to a leg press than a leg press to a squat. And that's important to keep in mind too, so that if we're kind of talking about cycling these lifts, if you've gotten great at the squat, there are many components of strength, right? There's the skill development, there's the muscle's ability to produce force, there's hypertrophy as a factor in strength. So if you keep training that squat, you've likely optimized the technique, the motor firing patterns, like all of those things, the mood state, all of those things you've likely perfected. So there's not many ways to improve other than hypertrophy at a certain point. So now if we go to something like a leg press or move away from just hitting that top single in the back squat, now we start working on some hypertrophy. Now we're going to get some of that carryover to filling in that last bucket of the components of strength of that hypertrophy. And the skill of that squat doesn't go away. You don't need much to keep that skill. You just need to hit it every once in a while. And I know Eric has talked about this as well, is he's gotten away from like the traditional bodybuilding training to do Olympic weightlifting and strongman. But when he goes back to the bodybuilding stuff, he hasn't lost all of his strength. Like it's still there. So we keep the skills from our movements way better than we may think. So don't be afraid to, like we're kind of saying, don't be afraid to deviate from that. Definitely learn the foundational skills, the foundational movements, and you'll get some of that carryover to when you do your more isolation type machine based movements.
Yeah, because what I've noticed with like squatting, like Monday, I squatted again, and I can tell like the strength was there. Like I could have lifted a lot more than I did because I put 275 on for a couple sets of 6. I probably could have easily put 3 plates or more, but the technique I knew wasn't there. It felt very odd putting that bar back on my back. And on the first rep of each set, I was like looking like grandpa on the way down. Like it was just, I was going so slow just to kind of feel my way and acclimate, find depth, make sure everything was like, I was like, again, the fear. I'm like, okay, I got to keep my back a certain way. Don't deviate. So I was like, I just lost the skill of it. But the strength was still there though, which is kind of interesting because I think the Smith hack squat, like my quads are definitely strong from that. And like my hyperextensions, my RDLs, all my hip hinging, it's all like the performance is up. So like there's no strength loss or anything like that. It was just more of a skill. But I can kind of see how there's definitely some carryover there. And I think Brad too. I think was it Brad that he wasn't direct squatting or direct deadlift. I can't remember, but one or the other. But he didn't do one of those lifts for a while. Went back to it and it was like he didn't lose much at all, if anything, because he still had one of the 2 big movements in there.
Yeah. And that's really important to keep in mind. That's basically what I do every day with working with athletes, as I try to find ways to change painful movement patterns or variables of a movement pattern to maintain a training effect and then slowly integrate back into those movements. So we're constantly switching from different movements to different rep ranges and tweaking technique a little bit here and there. But the idea, and back to the lifting library, which is why it's such a great resource, is it's just basically like those old books, like Choose Your Own Destiny, or you kind of decide how you want the book to go, or what have you. If if this movement is painful, and we've ruled out all the other aspects of pain for simplicity's sake, why don't we try this variation of it? Why don't we try a floor press? Why don't we try this? Why don't we try that? So having the ability to be flexible is probably one of the keys to injury reduction and management for the long term career.
So let me
Yeah.
throw this at you. So let's say I'm the guy that only has 2 years under his belt, and I'm like, I got to be optimal. So Nick, if I go to floor press instead of bench press, I'm going to lose the range of motion. So I'm going to lose volume. I'm going to lose progression that way, aren't I?
I would say that's a great question, young Jeff. The one thing I'll say is, well, if we
Because I got to maximize my gains in a 5-year window, Nick. It's got to happen like right now.
I would say if we keep training the bench press, and you keep telling me that you feel like you have someone stabbing you in the shoulder, 9 out of 10 pain, you probably won't have a shoulder to do any volume in a few months or years. So if you think about it, the volume that we're doing with the floor press is probably better in the long term. But no, I would say, and that's something I get a lot. I say, well, we're going to switch from this movement to another movement. I don't want to do that. Like, I don't want to lose my gains in my chest, for example. It just goes then to explaining how we maintain these training effects much longer than we may think. Even time completely off. Not to plug another one of the things that I've made, but the quarantine comeback, where we talked about time completely off from training and how much we do maintain strength and size. So if we can take time completely off and still have that repeated bout effect, which is basically the more we do something, the better we get at doing it. Think of like the first time driving a car. We're all tense, our shoulders are tense, our hands are tense, we're sweating, our heart's racing. After you drive a car for a couple years, you could drive and not even know if you stop at every traffic light, because it's just such an automatic thing. Similar to our gains that we make, we can tap into that repeated bout effect the more that we do it. It doesn't take much to keep it. So what I would say to that person is, don't fear losing your size or strength, because you're likely not going to, because the floor press, if you think about it, is really, really similar to a bench press compared to time completely off, or a cable fly, or it's still pretty darn close. So yeah, that's kind of how I would approach that.
So, I mean, because, yeah, that's like the biggest fear with people when they switch, like they switch over from a movement they feel like, hey, I'm making good progress on, or hey, this is considered more optimal. And then they go from, let's say, that bench press or dumbbell press, like traditional pressing, to now a floor press, which is a shorter range of motion. So that's the biggest fear. But the thing that I always kind of look at is, what does it take to actually see atrophy? And that would be zero training at all for a prolonged period of time. So you're still training that same musculature. Yes, it's a little bit less range of motion. Arguably, it could be maybe more tension, because there's maybe not as much momentum and things like that. And the way I kind of look at it is, you're just, in a sense, resetting your baseline, because you're not going to atrophy. You're not going to regress, because you're still training. You're just resetting. So that new exercise, even if it's less volume or range of motion rather, you're still going to try to progress it. You're still going to try to add reps. You're still going to try to add, load, maybe sets. So your volume from that baseline is going to go up again. So you're still going to see some type of gains. The question is, which movement actually facilitates the most gains? How do you even start to even quantify that? You would have to actually run like this specific trial to just your case. And it would take a lot of time with not that many moving parts. So your data is nice and consistent. So to me, I'm like, why am I going to lose sleep stressing over that? Like, the fact is, if I have to go to a different movement, because whether it's aches or pains or what have you, I'm just happy that I'm able to still train on a high level and I could keep myself moving forward. And that's exactly what happened in 2019 when I was going through a prep. I think I tore my upper pec doing heavy ass RDLs. That's another lesson learned there. But I was very lucky that I was able to do what I was doing is I was doing a pin press on the Smith machine. So my range of motion was maybe the top third of the movement on a press for chest. And that was it. And that's all I can do. I was just happy that I could still train and progress from there. So obviously I started with light loads and then I worked my way up and eventually it got hard and I was progressing. But sometimes you gotta have to just, humble yourself a little bit, relax a little bit and be okay. And just think of it as just resetting your baseline is all.
Yeah. Back to that hypothetical floor press person, if their goal was
that's me.
if
That's Young Jeff. Remember, it's true story.
Wasn't that your rap name when you used to compete in rap freestyle battles, Young Jeff?
Yeah, that was me. Yeah, that was me.
Back to Young Jeff.
Then I'm going to become president. So from Young Jeff the rapper to now president. Yeah, that's me.
If the goal of that person was to barbell bench press, if they said, Nick, this is my favorite movement of all time. It gets me out of bed. I just love barbell bench pressing. Hypertrophy is great and strength is great, but all I want to do is just barbell bench press. Then I would approach that person similarly. So I would use the floor press perhaps, but then maybe I would put them on a bench and load a bar on a safety rack and have the bar right on their chest and then have them do like an isometric in that end range that you're not getting with the floor press. So have those elbows drift down a bit under the bench, press into the bar, and you can control the effort. You can do a 50% press, you can do a 75% press, you can ramp it up from a 50 to a 75, all these different parameters that we can work with, but at least we're getting stress on the tissue in that quote unquote painful range, if that's where the painful range is. And then we just gradually kind of progress back to the bench press. I know I've done that a handful of times with athletes.
So would you do that? So would you do that to kind of help with that situation? But then, like after that, then go to like the floor press or whatever to get the stimulus, like the stimulus we're after.
For sure. Yeah, I'd probably start with the floor press, get like the volume in there, get the heavy lifting in there, and then do the isometric stuff as like an accessory, and then eventually blend the two into a full bench press. Yeah, that's something that I found helpful. And I think that's a good kind of segue into the other thing that I wanted to ask how you approach it. And then I could say how I kind of approach it, although I kind of just did. But how do we transition from one exercise to another? So maybe one isn't working. So do we say, okay, we're going to stop cold turkey and we're going to start this? Or how do we kind of gradually integrate a new exercise into someone's routine to not completely shock their system?
So the way I've done it with some athletes, and maybe if it's not jiving well with what you think, then maybe I'll learn something here. But what I usually like, let's say we're going to go from conventional deadlift to sumo, and sumo's kind of like, oh shit, you never even been exposed to it. So it would be like, hey, let's start with sumo, light, maybe a couple of light sets, just more technique based, learn technique. And then let's get our regular work with conventional. Once that technique starts to improve, let's say it's 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks, however long it takes to kind of master that sumo, then I just start transitioning the workload. So it might be, okay, one set doing sumo, the rest of it's conventional. Then now it's two sumo, one conventional, and then eventually until you get to a point where now you're just fully transitioned over. So that's usually how I typically kind of run it as far as getting people to get to different exercises.
Almost identical to what I do. I've had people say we're talking about a squat, back pain with a squat. What I would do is and we're talking like they can't do a goblet squat then because they have pain. So it's that sensitive. If we can't do any kind of squatting pattern, we would use like a hack squat or leg press or split squat for their main volume. But then maybe like during their warm up, I would have them do a box squat with an unloaded bar just to kind of groove the pattern, do 3 sets of that. We're not even coming close to fatigue. We're just showing the body, hey, it's okay to kind of groove this movement without pain. And then we do our loading in the comfortable exercise. And then we kind of progress those little warm-up sets gradually, and maybe we put a little bit of weight on, or maybe we lower the box, and as it's being tolerated better and better, and we're still getting our volume from the feel good exercise variation. And then eventually, like you said, then we eventually blend the two, and we maybe do one heavier set of the squats, and then 3 sets of the leg press, and then we kind of keep going like that. But the cool thing about that is, if there's ever a hiccup, we just take one step back, because we went at it in a stepwise fashion. So you can kind of retrace your steps, and everyone is so different. That's why I haven't created the 6 steps to injury reduction template, because it doesn't exist, because everyone is so different.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's how I would go about integrating a new movement, and it's cool that we both kind of do it the same way and have come about that through probably different paths.
Right. Yeah. How do you, like, as far as like with exercises, how do you kind of know more or less like what's a good rep range for a movement? Because I think rep range is pretty important as far as like finding a groove on specific movements. Like with the experience that I have, I can kind of say, okay, squat, we're going to be in the neighborhood of like, and talking like from a bodybuilding perspective, okay, I'm going to have a person more likely like in the 5 to 10 area. Like below 5, it's like, okay, it's pretty burdensome on the connective tissue. 4 might be a little suspect. And then over 10 is like, it's cardio. So most people, like working with so many people, 5 to 10 is kind of like sweet spots. And so how do you kind of go about, like, what do you think of like when you're, okay, I've got to program a specific person or yourself, like how do you know what rep ranges to kind of work towards?
Yeah. No, yeah, it's a really good question. I'm going to use an analogy from Scott Morrison. So Scott Morrison, for those of you who don't know, is like the Greg Nuckols of physical therapists. That's the best way to describe him in every sense
then
of the
he's
word.
super smart.
Yeah, for sure.
He's going to go for president then, not me.
So the analogy that Scott uses is, if you have a bull in front of you and you have to guess the weight of the bull, we probably know it's not 100 pounds, and we also know that it's probably not 10,000 pounds. But if we could guess somewhere in the middle, it's not so important that we pick the right starting point. It's just that we pick a starting point that makes sense, and then we're able to change it. So we have to keep it like an open feedback loop, where we're starting somewhere that makes logical sense, but then we're always looking for feedback to change it. So almost like getting into the shower. Like you put the water on with the hot and cold, where somewhere you think it's going to be reasonably comfortable. You may touch it with your hand and it's like, okay, that feels pretty good. Maybe you adjust it, and then you step in and it feels a little bit different than you thought, so you adjust it again. Similar way that I go about.
Well, in my house, if you turn the kitchen sink on, the person in the downstairs shower starts screaming. That's really fun, man. It's like, but anyways.
I'm glad that my house isn't the only one. For me, it's the slop sink in my basement. So I was washing my hands one morning. I was training down here, and I was washing my hands when I was done. And my wife was in the shower. And apparently, I guess it's close to the hot water tank, the slop sink in the basement. So it must take, I don't know, precedence over the other things. There's probably plumbers who are like smashing their heads against the wall right now listening to us. But yeah, I'm glad my house isn't the only like crazy house that does that. But yeah, so basically the idea is that we don't have to pick the perfect temperature of the water before we go in. What's important, and if we weren't allowed to change the temperature of the water once we got in, that would be the problem. So it's just important that we keep that open feedback loop and we're able to adjust. So I would usually shoot for anywhere from like 6 to 12 reps, keeping RPE in check, just because that's a fairly good place where most people feel comfortable, where it's not like we're not doing anything, but it's also not like we're just repping out rep after rep, and we may get some lower back fatigue in there. If it's a back squat, we're kind of grooving the movement in a comfortable rep range, and then we just kind of modify and progress and change it from there.
Yeah, because we kind of know, like through the research, like we can be pretty much within any rep range and still create hypertrophy depending upon the intensity level, like appropriate to failure where we need to be.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what like. That kind of cures a lot of insecurity with people. You know, when you're kind of like, because I'll ask like on this specific movement, where's kind of your sweet spot where you feel like you can get that good mind muscle connection. You have really solid form. You're not really thinking about it too much. It feels comfortable, safe, and all that. And usually if, you know, you'll get somewhat of a range, someone might say, hey, this exercise feels good in 10 to 12. Like, okay, that's where we're going to program. That's where we're going to start with. Unless it's just really wacky. Like, I'm going to do 3 to 5 reps on my laterals. I'm like, yeah, let's not do that. So, you know, kind of like knowing the experience level, like knowing the practicality of movements. I know in my mind, like where the general rep range is probably going to fall. And then I asked that question for certain individuals, like in your experience, where is it feeling the best? Sometimes it's like I said, it can be weird. Like they might like, hey, I like doing squats, 15 to 20s. And I'm like, we might be able to do a little bit better, the lower rep range. Cause when you're doing like something that's 15 to 20 reps on a squat, like it's hard to gauge where your reps in reserve are. Like you're probably dying of cardiovascular failure than you are as like actual, muscle fatigue. So like you kind of like take all that into consideration, kind of figure out what's going to be like probably the most optimal for that person based on like many layers of context. Because I think oftentimes like when we think exercise selection, we think, okay, this is the best exercise for that muscle group. And this is the best rep range. And man, it's like trying to conform to that. It can really kind of hinder a lot of things as far as like people's ability to actually execute the movement really well and to sustain it.
Yeah, and that should be comforting, like you said, because if hypertrophy is the goal, as long as we're getting somewhere close to failure, we're probably got our bases covered. Another Scott Morrison example is, did you ever see the movie Office Space?
No.
So there's this scene where it's kind of like a spoof on like typical office, like cubicle, and like it's just kind of like a classic movie, like The Office, the TV show, but before The Office. And there's this scene where they're like the managers are around in a conference room, and they're like, "Who's this guy?" And they're like, "Oh, that's so and so. He actually got fired like a couple months ago, but no one told him. So like he just wasn't getting paid, or he was never taken off payroll or something." And they're like, "So we just fixed the glitch in the system, and so now he's not gonna get paid anymore." So they're like, "Oh, so you didn't actually tell him that he's not to come back to work? He's just not gonna get paid." They're like, "Yeah, we just fixed the glitch, so he's just not gonna get paid. He'll figure it out." So that's kind of like what training to failure is we kind of fix the glitch. We just kind of like cover our bases and make sure that we're able to find that rep range that feels best to us with a certain movement, get somewhere close to failure, and we'll still be able to get that training effect that we want.
Yeah, it's covering the big rocks.
Yeah. Well, young Jeff, I think we've covered a lot. Are there any like final points that you want to make, or anything that we didn't get to maybe?
I think the biggest one for me is just I want to say this again, is like be inquisitive, ask questions. Like if you see someone who might be a little ahead in their journey, ask questions, because I think oftentimes we're only gravitating towards the evidence-based side of things, but there's a lot to take from actual experience. So I think if you're inquisitive, you can, it may not apply to your situation, like whatever this X person is doing at the moment, but it might help you down the road when maybe you come upon a similar situation. So you're just acquiring a lot more knowledge, a lot more tools that you might be able to use to better your journey.
Definitely a theme that we've talked about a lot with 3D Muscle Journey is we kind of want to learn how to learn, and kind of learn how to think, and that idea of seeking out others and learning from other people and trying different things. And I mean, that's got nothing to do with load or reps or sets or exercise. That's just between the ears. And I think I think that's probably one of the most powerful things we could do on all of our journeys, not only to stay injury free, but to stay in the iron game and keep progressing.
And be willing to experiment. Like Don't be scared to experiment. Like you may not know the answers up front, and that's okay. That's how you learn. Like you actually try something out, and again, you take notes. Like what I do is I turn the cold water just like a quarter way, and you get that little scream, ah! But if you turn it full blast, it's like, ah! It's like, yes. So I know the intensity, that's where the intensity needs to be. So you have to kind of play around with the water faucet to kind of figure out where the temperature's at.
And not to keep going down this faucet analogy, but every faucet is different, right? If you go to the hotel and all of a sudden this faucet looks different and it feels different and there's different pressure, you have to be on your toes and you have to be able to adapt. But you can use the same strategies that you used in your own home. You can use your same.
This is a great
system.
analogy because when I tell my son, he's like he's 8, so like a year ago we're teaching him how to turn the water up hot, cold, and so that way I don't have to keep doing it for him. So now he knows like how to adjust it, where the temperature's at. I tell him, hey, touch the water before you get in, make sure it's where it needs to be, and I'll make sure I don't touch the kitchen sink while you're getting in the shower. And so he's learned how to figure out where everything needs to be. So I think a lot of times, like as bodybuilders, because I mean, it's great. We have all this information at our disposal. Like people listening to us right now, they're looking for answers, right? But sometimes you just have to learn as you go, and it's okay to do that. And I think just like, don't be scared to do that, because you're going to learn a lot more just by going through all your experiences.
Yeah. Well, I found my new favorite analogy for everything is the faucet analogy. Jeff, it's always a pleasure connecting with you and shooting the breeze a little bit.
It was a good time. I just got to work on my rapping skills and I got to work on my presidential speeches, but we'll get there.
And I look forward to a potential episode of everyone on the team just talking about fails in the gym that they've had. And but I don't know that anyone will top the leg press story. That was pretty epic.
That's it. You know what I learned from there? Don't eat too much before leg pressing.
And on that note, everybody, thank you for tuning into this episode of the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.
Hey guys, this is Coach Alberto Nunez. Thanks so much for listening to our show today. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. I wanted to take a moment to remind you guys that we have a giant video library of educational materials at 3dmjvault.com. The Vault is a place where we have organized our best information, paired it up with some of our favorite resources, and shared with all of you guys in one online database. We have courses on contest prep, hypertrophy, posing, fat loss, postseason recovery, and a whole lot more. Most of it is free. Some of it is for purchase to help support this podcast, and we continue adding pieces of updated content to it every couple of months that members always have unlimited access to. Once again, that's 3dmjvault.com, and we really hope you like it.